So I think I will start, Ronald. Okay, welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to have you with us today and our speakers for the third webinar of our series on attacks on academic freedom. This one is titled The Silencing of Palestine and Palestinian Voices. I will start with some very generic indications. So first of all, and Yousaf, who is collaborating with us today, my friend Yousaf, who is collaborating with us, you will copy all of this that I'm saying now, write this in the chat, so just some indications on how to proceed with the questions and comments. So what question, if you have any question, please write the question in the chat and indicate if you would like to ask it yourself or have the question read out. If you want to ask yourself, you don't need to write the question. Just indicate that you want to make a question. Feel free to write your question during the talks. We will take them in the order that they are sent, and Yousaf will help us organize this today. In terms of conduct, as always, we will not accept any Islamophobic or anti-Semitic behavior or any other form of discrimination or harassment, whether based on race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, beliefs, age, disability, or socioeconomic background. And we encourage anyone with experience or has experienced or witnessed any form of discrimination or harassment to come forward and tell us. And now Ronald will make some generic, so also start with our introduction on academic freedom and what has brought us today. Then I will be more specific about today's webinar and then our speakers for the first part. Ronald.
Thank you, Carlos, and welcome everyone. So very briefly, just let me say a few things about how we frame and address academic freedom in the context of our webinars. Academic freedom is a contested concept, and for our seminars, we refer to a few characteristics of academic freedom highlighted in several declarations and the literature. In a landmark declaration, the American Association of University Professors defined 3 elements of academic freedom: freedom of inquiry and research, freedom of teaching within the university or college, and freedom of extramural utterance and action. In the UK, the Education Reform Act defines academic freedom as the freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom without placing employees in jeopardy of losing their jobs. Finally, the UNESCO recommendation from 1979 declares that academic freedom includes the freedom of teachers and scholars to express freely opinions about the institution or system in which they work, and the freedom from institutional censorship. In line with these conceptualizations, we want to explore, in the context of our webinar, the role of academic freedom in protecting those whose thinking challenges the orthodoxy of the discipline, or those who challenge power relations, injustice, and inequalities within their institution and society. As Judith Butler puts it, the freedom to imagine a transformation of society is part of academic freedom. However, this freedom is under attack. In our first 2 webinars about Groningen, other Dutch cases, and last webinar, the Leicester case, we discussed institutional overreach and managerial attacks on academic freedom and critical scholarship. Today, we are here to discuss the silencing of Palestinian voices. Discussing academic freedom may seem maybe like a distraction or even misplaced right now. However, in general terms, there's a link between what can be said, who can speak, who is listening, who is not listening, what happens and what needs to be done. Thus, before we listen to our first speaker, let me share a few personal observations. First, we are witnessing the dismantling of critical concepts, the silencing of critical scholars, and the discrediting of expertise and scholarship in general. In a programmatic way, this was already articulated by Christopher Rufo. I quote, "Conservatives need to create a strong association between Hamas, Black Lives Matter, DSA, and academic decolonization in the public mind. Connect the dots, then attack, delegitimize, and discredit. Make the center-leftists avoid them, make them political untouchables." As Priyamada Gopal wrote in reference to decolonization, taking a concept and turning it into its opposite is an old establishment strategy to discredit challenges to injustice, which does not mean that we should not criticize our own assumptions, theories, worldviews, etc. This is part of our job, I think. Second, we are witnessing the dismantling of supranational institutions. When Antonio Guterres wrote on Twitter or X that we are witnessing a killing of civilians that is unparalleled and unprecedented in any conflict since I'm a Secretary General, we can read comments like the United Nations is corrupt to its core. If you follow the tweets by the World Health Organization, you can read comments like health workers, the charade is up, you are run by Hamas, and so on. Third, we can observe a general attempt at stifling debate and critique. Lectures, exhibitions, and seminars are cancelled. Scholars have lost or are in fear of losing their jobs and livelihoods when they articulate solidarity with Palestine. Government ministers single out scholars who are critical of governmental positions. Social media accounts are monitored. Student associations are prohibited. Yesterday, Harvard Law Review pulled back an essay from a Palestinian scholar, and so on. To sum up, in my view, we are witnessing a discursive closure and a loss of plurivocality, which is affecting both components of academic freedom, academic work and freedom. I believe this matters because it not only stifles academic rigor, and we need academic rigor and expertise, but it has an utterly worrying impact on the principle of humanity. As Adam Tooze and others wrote in their response to a letter by Jürgen Habermas and others, solidarity means that the principle of human dignity must apply to all people. Said this, we should not forget that academic freedom is linked to the idea of democracy and a just and human society. Thank you. And now, next, Carlos, please.
Thank you, Ronald. So in this third webinar, we will debate specifically, as I said at the beginning, the silencing of Palestine and Palestinian voices. And there, though attempts to silence speech on Palestine and Palestinian voices is not new, as we all know, there has been an intensification and repression across the West, particularly in parts of Europe, the UK, and the United States, also in Canada, for what I've seen. Some of this occurs through specific tools, such as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Jewish racism. Much of this repression is also happening across social media platforms, which are employing various tactics to subdue speech deemed supportive of Palestinians or critical of Israel. And this is also one of the reasons we are not using Eventbrite anymore. The current war in Gaza, which has included the destruction of every university in Gaza, has considerably aggravated the attack on the academic freedom of Palestinians and those who speak out about Israel-Palestine and Palestinian rights. Government officials across the West have condemned anti-war protests, and we all have seen the shameful declarations of the President of the European Union and also from several heads of government in Europe and all across the West. And I must say at this point that I've been feeling particularly ashamed of being European in the last weeks. But as I was saying, government officials have condemned anti-war protests and Palestine-related events at several universities have been cancelled. This happened also in cultural spaces. For instance, Adania Shibli, a Palestinian writer, had a award ceremony at the Frankfurt Book Fair cancelled. I think we also remember, or some of us remember, that some months ago in London, a hospital canceled an exhibition of paintings made by children from Gaza, Palestine. I will repeat, an exhibition of paintings made by children from Gaza. People were feeling anxious because of this. So we thought that for this webinar, it would be central. It would be important to center Palestinian voices. And before we do that, if you allow me this kind of self-indulgence, I will center just the experience I have had in the last couple of days, and actually a week, but last couple of days, just for announcing this webinar last week and for announcing also an open letter I wrote to the European egos, I've received several emails, some public and much more private, some of them very vulgar and gross, some threatening. And but I would like to say two things about that I think are essential at this point. The first one is that co-curating this webinar today, and I wrote this before, and I will repeat it. I started my academic journey in 2015. And this is by far the most important thing I've done so far since I started my academic journey. For me personally, this is the most important thing. The second thing is that I could quote now some amazing Black activist scholars, but I will quote something from someone who is, and I think you will understand, much more important to me, my mom. My mom taught my sister Joanna and me something very important since we were very young. She told us, always do what you have to do. And when people try to put you in your place, or what they perceive to be your place, what you should do is immediately put them in their place. And so we are moving now with our webinar, and our first speaker today is Samer Abdelnour. He is a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh Business School. His ongoing research project examines how collective enterprise and technology interventions influence new forms of organizing in humanitarian and post-war settings, research methods and ethics in relation to violent contexts, and interconnections between innovation, ecosystems, and military technologies. Samer also co-founded the global think tank I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and occasionally speaks, well, not just occasionally, a lot actually, but occasionally speaks and writes about Israel-Palestine, including on the top of academic freedom. So the floor or the screen is yours, Samir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to start by thanking Ronald and Carlos for creating space for us, for your wonderful words as well, and for gathering us here today to speak about the silencing of Palestine and Palestinian voices as part of the series on academic freedom. I think I'll reiterate some of the maybe the ethos of Carlos and Ronald, where it's really essential, I think, especially at times like these, to normalize such conversations, elevate our understanding and challenge silencing. I'm also really delighted to be joined by both Marwa and Muhannad, two people I admire so much for the work that they do, and also for everyone here today. I see many friends, many colleagues, students have joined us today, and new faces as well. And at times like this, it actually means so much to just see people's faces and knowing that you've taken your time out to join today in these really difficult times. So thanks for everyone for being here. I plan to use my time to speak about three things. First, what's happening with regards to academic freedom regarding Palestine. I'll mainly focus on the UK experience, though there are parallels, as Carlos had noted, across Europe, especially in France, Germany, and Italy, also the US, Canada, and Australia. I'll also speak about the mentioned International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or the IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism and how it's used to silence speech about Palestine and Palestinian rights. And then what I'll aim to do as well is to try to frame these within broader national and geopolitical context, which I think is something that's often less discussed, very much observed, but might help us make sense of what's happening on a bigger scale. So in terms of academic freedom and silencing on Palestine, the shocking violence we've witnessed in Gaza and across historic Palestine over the past 6 weeks has been matched by an intensified repression of academic freedom across the West, not surprisingly, in the very countries that provide Israel political, military, and economic support. Both the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, BRISMIS, it's a UK-based organization, and the European Legal Support Center, ELSC, which has offices in the UK and also Europe, have documented dozens of attacks on university faculty, staff, and students for speaking out about Palestine, and particularly the genocide in Gaza, mostly on false charges of anti-Semitism, often utilizing the IHRA, or accusations of supporting terrorism under the UK's anti-terrorism strategy known as PREVENT, which is a tool that over the past decade has permeated higher education across the UK, putting foreign students and faculty at risk of losing their visas. The ELSC has been inundated with reports of attacks on faculty and students, surveillance of social media posts, surveillance of student protests, including by faculty and other students, policing language on campus, slanderous complaints against faculty leading to investigation and suspension, suspending student groups, canceling courses about Palestine, canceling events, and even arrests of students, with women and people from racialized backgrounds being disproportionately targeted. The feeling on UK campuses right now is one of fear and one of hostility. And this climate of fear is being stoked in part by state officials, including the Prime Minister, former Home Secretary, Secretary of State for Education, as well as organizations such as Universities UK, whose members include principals and vice chancellors of 140 universities across the UK, all of whom have issued statements equating Palestine chants, Palestine flags, and Palestine protest with hate speech. However, it would be a mistake to think this started on October 7. Rather, anti-Palestine silencing at UK universities has been happening for years, even decades, not only in the UK, actually, if I should say. In fact, I could probably spend an entire webinar just myself speaking to my own personal encounters with silencing and anti-Palestinian racism in academia as an undergrad, as a grad student, and my experiences also with academic journals. Moving on to the IHRA quote-unquote working definition of anti-Semitism, I'd like to take a step back and give a sense of what its underlying kind of ethos is. The IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism embodies principles of what is known as the new anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism is an attempt to expand conventional notions of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel, a state, and Zionism, a political ideology and a movement. This is in contrast with conventional understandings of anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish discrimination, anti-Jewish hatred, and anti-Jewish violence, which is recognized to be primarily an Anglo-European phenomenon rooted in white supremacy. And as a side note, I might add that Jewish communities lived in relative calm across the MENA region, or the Southwest Asia and North Africa region, until the Zionist movement gained strength in Palestine and the creation of Israel. The current version of the IHRA has 4 clauses that specifically refer to Israel and Zionism, including the suggestion that claiming that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. Of course, for those of us whose families were dispossessed for being native savages, to use the words of early Zionist thinkers, or those living under apartheid, to use the words of B'Tselem or Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or a plethora of Palestinian rights organizations, or targeted for annihilation for being human animals, to use recent speak by Israeli leaders. For us, Israel is indeed a racist endeavor. I could speak to the other clauses, But the point here is that the IHRA risks being strategically weaponized to silence speech on Palestine, and we are not alone in our concern. Over 350 Jewish and Israeli scholars have signed a letter rejecting the IHRA and showing their support for an alternative definition known as the Jerusalem Declaration, which in many ways is better, but still is problematic. Even the founder of the IHRA, Kenneth Stern, distanced himself from it, saying it was developed as a data collection tool, not as a definition. Hence, he notes it is both unfit for purpose and susceptible to being weaponized. Expanding anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel, again a state, and Zionism, again a political ideology and a movement, as the IHRA does, risks rendering the act of criticizing Israel and Zionism forms of racism and thus hate crimes. This is not just unacceptable for Palestinians and those in solidarity with us, but there is also the danger in setting the precedent of criminalizing critique of states and political ideology in this way. Coming to the UK, on 9, and I'm going to talk just a moment about IHRA in UK higher education before closing on my last point. On 9 October 2020, then Education Secretary Gavin Williamson issued a letter to vice chancellors across the UK demanding universities adopt the IHRA. In that letter were threats of funding cuts and also the threat of restricting student registration for universities that chose not to ratify it. While a few universities did indeed hesitate on the pretext that the IHRA is controversial and divisive, Williamson's threat led to widespread top-down imposition of the IHRA across UK universities and actually in the process violating UK law, namely the UK Equality Act's duty to consult communities that are possibly affected, especially those at risk of being harmed, and in this case, students and faculty who speak, teach, write, or organize on issues related to Palestine and Palestinian rights. And indeed, the IHRA has had a tangible chilling effect on academic freedom in the UK. And it has been implicated in the strategic targeting of academics and students. So, in fact, there was a recent report published by BRISMUS and the ELSC, which documents 40 cases of the IHRA being invoked in baseless accusations of anti-Semitism against faculty. And in 39 of those cases, accusations were dropped. And in one case was still ongoing, but it looked like the accusations would soon be dropped. So it is being used, it is creating a chilling effect on UK campuses. And of course, we aren't accepting this without a fight. Faculty, unions, and civil society groups are organizing against the IHRA, not just in the UK, across the West, and also at the United Nations, actually. Now, my final point I'd like to make is about this broader national and geopolitical context. Now, as mentioned, efforts to silence speech on Palestine and Palestinian rights, and with it, criticism of Israel, is happening across the West, most notably in countries with close ties to Israel. Germany, the source of the worst anti-Semitic violence in modern history, has embraced the IHRA with a repressive fervor, invoking it to cancel academic and cultural events, to justify police suppression of protests, even targeting Jewish academics, Jewish students, and Jewish activists who express criticism of Israel or support Palestinian rights. And this should give us all pause for thought when we think about what anti-Semitism is. Today, Anglo-European countries where anti-Semitism originated and continues to thrive are leading what Palestinian legal and Islamic studies scholar Lina Salameh refers to as the war on anti-Semitism, which, not unlike the war on terrorism, seeks to provide material, political, and strategic cover for the West's global geopolitical ambitions, including access to oil and gas, and increasingly protecting Israel's weapons industries. Hence, we find the utilization of the IHRA occurring in parallel with efforts to shield Israel from accountability and protest. In the UK, This has manifested as an anti-boycott bill, which is right now being pushed through Parliament, which specifically seeks to stop the boycott of Israel. And similarly, we see it in anti-boycott, anti-protest legislation being pushed in the UK and many of the aforementioned countries. So in this way, the IHRA shouldn't be seen as a standalone tool, but part of a broader effort to silence dissent in the service of a political interest. Hence why challenging it is essential. What's at stake isn't just academic freedom, but as Ronald alluded to, our wider democratic rights. And I think I'll stop here, and I'm of course happy to engage further during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Samer. So let me introduce our second speaker, Marwa. Marwa Fatafta leads Access Now's policy and advocacy work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region. She's an advisory board member of the Palestinian digital rights organization, Seven and a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian policy network working on issues of political leadership, governance, and accountability. Before joining Access Now, Marwa worked at the MENA Regional Advisor at Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin and coordinated regional and global efforts to mainstream gender into anti-corruption policies and norms. She previously served as a communications manager at the British Consulate General in Jerusalem. She was a Fulbright scholar to the US and holds a Master in International Relations from Syracuse University and a Master in Development and Governance from the University of Duisburg-Essen. Marwa is a feminist killjoy, a painter, and finally, a chocolate addict. Marwa, the screen is yours.
Thank you for sharing that bit from my bio. I thought it's buried on our organization's website, but thank you so much for organizing this event, Ronald and Carlos. And I also want to echo Samer's introductory remarks that it's at times like these, it's very crucial for us to hold such spaces where our voices are criminalized and censored, not only in academia, but across the board. As you can tell from my bio, I'm not an academic and I'm not a scholar. I don't work at a university, I don't teach, but I work on so-called digital rights. And essentially for a global human rights organization called Access Now, and our mission is to defend and extend of rights of people and communities at risk. And that in a nutshell means I look at how technologies impact us in our way to exercise our rights, and that includes the issue of online censorship, which has been an issue for Palestinians and those who also discuss or demand or advocate for Palestinian rights online. And my foray into the issue of academic freedom goes back to 2020 when San Francisco State University had planned an event that invited Palestinian feminist and militant Layla Khalid for a discussion on gender, feminism, and revolution. And quickly and unilaterally Zoom, which is the platform that we are currently using, had decided to cancel the event. And then shortly after, Facebook also shut down the event on its platform, and 23 minutes into the streaming of the event, also YouTube decided to shut down. And that, to me, raised a huge flag about how social media companies or tech companies at large control and police not only our ability to express ourselves online, but also academic freedom. And one might ask, what are the reasons? And I'm happy to get into the reasons why we see Palestinians, and not only Palestinians, but anyone really who shares or advocates for Palestinian rights gets censored online. And I'll touch upon this point and then another issue that intersects with academic freedom. And I think Carlos and Samer had alluded to, and that is the issue of doxing and monitoring and surveillance of people's speech online and how that is utilized and weaponized to attack and harass students and scholars and professors at universities. Going back to the San Francisco State University, interestingly enough, there was a pushback from a number of universities that thought that this is a clear infringement upon the rights that a private tech company decides what events can be held online. And mind you, that happened in the midst of COVID-19, so there was no way for anyone to hold any in-person events. That was the only available venue for people to convene and discuss issues. And so in October that year, 10 universities came together on a kind of a national day in protest over the criminalization and censorship of free speech. And they attempted to invite Layla Khalid, or screen actually a recording of a video recording of her. And again, Zoom and Facebook decided to shut down those events in 2 universities, University of Hawaii and also NYU. We have been in conversation with Zoom and push back against what they claim to be a violation of their own terms of services. Now, every company, tech company, has their own terms of services. And according to the US law, and as many of those companies are US-based companies, they are indeed free to moderate and dictate their own rules about what is permissible and what is not. And for Zoom, Meta, I mean Facebook back then, and others, they have very clear and strict rules around terrorism or alleged terrorism, whereby platforms, according to US law, are not allowed to provide any material support to designated groups in the US. And also platforms take that a step further. A company like Meta, for instance, prohibits any content that supports, praises, or represents what they call dangerous individuals and organizations. And these are designated groups and individuals that the company has full discretion to decide who is dangerous and who is not. But usually they do follow the US terrorist list by State Department and also the Treasury. But the thing is that they don't publish who the list. They despite much pressure from civil society and also from their own oversight board, that this list should be made public. People have the right to know the rules that govern their speech online. But unfortunately, the company has been pushing back. It has been leaked to the press. And thanks to those leaks, we understand who has been on this list, which I think comprises of at least 4,000 individuals and organizations. Surprise, surprise, the majority of them are from the MENA region, from the Arab world, and also from the Muslim world. And also from working on these issues, and particularly over the past few weeks, there has been a very clear pattern where these companies, in order to avoid being liable under US law, but also because of their own rules, and we can get to the political affiliations of platforms later, but they tend to over comply with the law. So they would rather censor and let's say err on the side of over compliance and censor people than be in a hot seat, let's say in the Congress, being questioned around why they're allowing terrorist content online, which we've seen this pressure recently, specifically from the European Commission early on after Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, where the European Commission had sent public letters to platforms asking them to quickly remove illegal content, or what the European Commission considers to be illegal content. And that in reality means more censorship of Palestinian voices, because platforms, again, would rather over comply and remove as much content as they can in order not to get in hot waters with governments. I think the number one repellent, or let's say the worst fear for these companies, is to be regulated by governments. And as I said, they have been enjoying self-governance and self-rule for quite a long time. They set the rules and they implement them with very little insight, little transparency, little accountability. And therefore, they would rather please governments than please us, the users and civil society at large. So, you know, if you take a company like Meta these days, their policy on dangerous individuals and organizations has disproportionately impacted and censored Palestinians. The way they implement these policies, they use automation. I think Facebook, for instance, relies on automated algorithms that detect and so automatically detect and flag and remove content that violates their terms of services. For Facebook, they rely on in their content moderation decisions, they rely up to 94% of the time on algorithms. For Instagram, they rely 98% in their decisions on algorithms. And if you look at Arabic content or non-English languages, these algorithms are really poorly and insufficiently trained, to the point that if you just mention the word, for example, Hamas, which is designated to according to the platform, that can take your content down, even if you are, let's say, a Washington Post reporter and you're just writing a journalistic post on that. So you're not necessarily praising or representing or supporting that group.
Oh, I thought I'd quickly call you in. I'm in between doing interviews, but
okay, sorry, I cannot see you there.
No, I can't. You don't need to check your camera.
Okay.
I'm not sure what's going on, but I'll resume. And so these restrictions, as in how the platforms design their policies and how they enforce them, have been quite problematic and have made the online space really, really tiny and heavily policed and monitored. To the point that Samad had mentioned about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, there's also been a strong and aggressive push by Israeli lobby and also Zionist groups in the US on Meta and Twitter at the time, now X, to adopt this definition. And one can imagine, of course, what kind of a cocktail that would lead to an over-explosion of censorship when you have very vague definitions and then you have algorithms that cannot differentiate or understand nuanced speech, and also over-enforcement of policies. And we have pushed back against the adoption of the IHRA definition, but there's also been more problematic policies whereby some platforms, and specifically Meta, conflate Zionism with Judaism and anti-Semitism. So if you, for example, criticize Zionism or Zionists, Meta considers it to be a proxy for Israelis or a proxy for Jews, and therefore that can be hate speech. So again, we are, unfortunately, when it comes to these tech platforms, are dealing with biased policies that criminalize a Palestinian content. We have the lack of transparency and the over-enforcement of those policies. And whenever we see violence escalating, it's almost predictable that we will have people being shadow banned, their content removed. We've seen some very disturbing examples over the past few weeks whereby not only accounts are being shut and content removed, but also things like, innocuous comments with Palestinian flag emojis being hidden on Instagram because the platform considers it to be borderline offensive. We've also seen the mistake or the glitch by Instagram where the bios of Palestinians that contain the Palestinian flag have been auto-translated into Palestinians fight terrorists, or Palestinian terrorists are fighting for their freedom. For people who work on, artificial intelligence and machine learning, one of course wonder what kind of data has been fed into those systems that automatically associate Palestinians with terrorists. And these are just, small examples that just manifest how tech companies at large approach Palestinians and Palestinian speech. On the other hand, we see that Hebrew content, hate speech, disinformation, incitement to violence, and even explicit calls for the genocide and the mass killing of Palestinians are often left to flourish on the platforms. And there are simple reasons behind that. The platforms do not have any systems or classifiers, for instance, to detect and moderate and remove that content in real time. And there's heavy lobbying, especially by the Israeli government and the so-called cyber unit that continues submitting, monitoring Palestinian social media posts and submitting requests. So we see the heavy-handed approach to Palestinians on the one hand, but also the allowance of hate speech and disinformation to foster and flourish on those platforms. And that leads me to my second point related to how people's freedom of expression and their posts are used and weaponized to dox them, to harass them, and to really spin smear campaigns. There are multiple examples, not only during the past few weeks, but over the last few years, where professors and students have been doxed. And by doxing, we mean, their private information shared on social media without their consent, including their pictures, their employers, their email addresses, and sometimes even their home addresses, which allows for potential violent ramifications against them, or pressuring or emailing their employers or pressuring their employers to cut their ties or end their contracts. And we've seen how many professors had lost their jobs or lost job opportunities as a result of these campaigns. The Canary Mission website is just one egregious example of how social media posts and activism can be utilized to dox and harass individuals. This website, have people's images and also sometimes quotes that are taken out of context to harass them. I mean, here in Germany, where I currently live, we've also seen how some media outlets have mined people's accounts, social media accounts, looking for, one or two or three tweets to build a narrative that those individuals are anti-Semitic or terrorist sympathizers. I have been on the receiving end of those smear campaigns where I have been called a BDS sympathizer. I think they didn't manage to see much on my digital footprint, and so they found the closest claim that they can smear my reputation in Germany. So to end on this point, I think, as someone who works on digital rights and digital security, it really highlights the importance of how we can protect ourselves online and think about our digital footprint and our presence on social media, but also on other private channels, and find ways where we can protect our data and ensure that, to the best ability that we can, that this personal information is protected and cannot be weaponized by malicious or bad faith actors. And to end, of course, for me, it's been a long battle looking at the outsized really power of private companies, actually a handful of private companies, to dictate the narration and who has the right to narrate, who has the permission to say what, and which speech is criminalized based really on the interests, sometimes financial, but others by geopolitical interests of these platforms. And as I mentioned earlier, how that also intersects with academic freedom and the ability of people to publicly debate things, which is quite an essential pillar of that freedom. I'll pass it back to you, Ronald or Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marwa. So our next speaker is Muhannad Ayyash. He was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds, before immigrating to Canada, where he is now professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence, published in 2019, and has recently finished writing another book, Lordship and Liberation in Palestine, Israel. He has published several academic articles on topics such as political violence, vaccine apartheid, anti-Palestinian racism, and Palestinian decolonial movements in journals such as the European Journal of International Relations, the European Journal of Social Theory, Distinction, and Critical Sociology. He has co-edited 2 books, the most recent with Jeremy Wildman, titled Canada as a Settler Colony on the Question of Palestine. He is also the author of multiple book chapters and has written opinion pieces for, among others, Al Jazeera, The Buffer, Middle East Eye, and the Middle East Monitor. Please, Muhannad, the floor is yours, or the screen in this case.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm speaking to you today from a place called Mohinstis, which is the Blackfoot name for the city that is now called Calgary. That's its settler colonial name. And I want to affirm that I'm speaking from the homelands of the Siksiga, the Bigani, the Gaina Nation, the Itka Stony Nakoda, which consists of the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Goodstoney bands, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation. And this is also home to the Métis Nation. And I hope that one day indigenous sovereignty flourishes on these lands once again, which have always been their homelands, still are their homelands today. The world will be a better place when indigenous sovereignty, which is an alternative to the Euro-American mode of settler colonial sovereignty, flourishes across the world, hopefully. I want to thank the organizers, Carlos, Ronald, for organizing this panel, for inviting me on it. Absolute pleasure to share it with people that I also respect very much. Samer, Marwa. Whenever people ask me about any question related to social media, I'm like, I'm out of my league. I look at Marwa's work, and I send them your way. I hope you don't get too many requests, Marwa. And I'd like to as well, Sam has done a great job explaining a lot about the IHRA, so I can just kind of skip any general explanation of it and just talk about it in specific ways towards the end. But let me start with comments that both Ronald and Carlos made, which are very important. That this event is not separate from what's going on today, and has never been separate from the Israeli state project. The attacks on academic freedom and freedom of expression and free speech, and however that's framed in whatever country you're in, on the question of Palestine are directly related to the Israeli settler colonial project. The Israeli settler colonial project is about expelling Palestinians from their lands. It's about eliminating Palestinian indigenous sovereignty on their lands. It's about eliminating Palestinians as a political entity. That's what the settler colonial Israeli state project is all about. And as that takes place in the land of historic Palestine, and as it continues to intensify today, the expulsion of the Palestinian critique of Israel and Zionism also gets intensified across the world, because the Israeli state sees the expulsion of Palestinians from their lands and the expulsion of the Palestinian critique of Israel and Zionism as part of the exact same project. They're both aiming to eliminate the existence of Palestinians as a historical people, as a political entity, as sovereign people, as a sovereign nation that has a deep sovereign connection to the land. So what you see in Germany, in the UK, in Canada, in the US, in France, as the silencing and censorship of the Palestinian critique is directly related to the Israeli state project. It's not separate from it at all. This is that expulsion of Palestinians from their land reaching your shores, because you exist in spaces that are part and parcel of the settler colonial project. You're not on neutral grounds. Nobody in Western Europe or North America or in Australia and other places too, nobody sits on neutral grounds on this issue. You're part of that Israeli settler colonial project. And since the Israeli state understands and understood from the beginning parts of the 20th century that it cannot achieve its settler colonial aims without the support of the Euro-American empires, namely the British and now the Americans, that they understand that therefore they need to maintain that deep alliance with those empires. And that therefore any type of discourse or critique or epistemology that comes in to challenge the Israeli state in some really serious ways, decolonial and anti-racist ways, that therefore is threatening to the Israeli settler colonial project, and that they must eliminate that kind of critique. So what do I mean when I say the Palestinian critique? It means, I mean, I do think that the sort of the leading experts on the Palestinian critique, those who have developed it and drove it, are Palestinians, but it's not restricted to Palestinians. Israeli scholars have participated and contributed and helped flourish the Palestinian critique. Non-Palestinian and non-Israeli and non-Jewish scholars have done that as well. So what it really is speaking to is a critique of the Zionism and the Israeli state. And Zionism is a political ideology, as Samer very excellently said. It's a critique of Zionist political ideology and the Israeli state's project from the experiences of its victims, the Palestinians. So that's the Palestinian critique. It centralizes the experiences and perspectives and aspirations of those who are violently oppressed and facing expulsion and elimination from the Israeli state project. So it's precisely that critique that the Israeli state has been intent on eliminating since its founding. Now, this effort starts to take on a different direction in and around the 1970s, when the concept of, quote unquote, the new anti-Semitism starts to be pushed forward. And I don't know why these balloons come up every once in a while, but I apologize for that. If anybody, Marwa, can you tell me how to erase those? You're my go-to on all things social media and tech. Just joking. But anyway, so this dates back to, my students get a kick out of this when it happens when I do virtual. Anyway, so this dates back to the early 1970s when Israeli foreign minister for the labor government, so-called, with its socialist roots and all that, Azevedo, he began pushing this narrative that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And he starts to advance this notion, and not just him alone, but I just want to point the person in the Israeli state that was very much, he was foreign minister. Azevedo is not a small character in the history of Israeli politics. So he was definitely pushing this narrative and advancing this notion of the new anti-Semitism. And there's no intellectual basis to this concept. It is a purely political weapon that is used by the Israeli state. This is strategic discourse from its foundation upwards. I think, serious scholar who looks at this does not find much intellectual basis to engage with this notion. And it basically attempts to make those Palestinian critiques of Israel and Zionism as anti-Semitic. It turns them into hate speech, into racist behavior and worldviews, into destructive feelings and all of the things that we associate with racism and hatred, right? So it turns that Palestinian experience of the Israeli state into, unhindered, unhinged racism and hatred towards Jews just because they're Jews. And that's what I mean when I argued in an article last year. You can find it online for free. The Toxic Other. This is precisely the toxification of the Palestinian critique and really Palestinian subjectivity itself as toxic. So people then start to associate just the word Palestine, or this in academia, the subject matter of Palestine, as something that is toxic, something, and I do use that word on purpose, toxic. Like people go, oh, that just is negative. That is just something I want to avoid. Once they make it untouchable, as one of the quotes that Ronald cited from the conservative politician, right? But this is widespread across the political spectrum. It tries to make it untouchable. Like nobody should touch this. And the message starts to being pushed as well, because it speaks in the language of anti-racism, right? Because it's saying, well, anti-Semitism is wrong, which of course it is, and it is part of the anti-racist struggle, which is of course it is, but it's weaponizing that. So it's using it in such a way where it is now taking legitimate, valid, honest critiques of Israel and Zionism from the perspective of the oppressed and the colonized, and turn it into hate speech and this irrational hatred of Jews just because they're Jews. And this effort continues to intensify and build, and it really picks up steam in the 2000s when BDS starts to gain steam. So when BDS starts to gain attention and becomes more widespread, people understand what BDS is. Some people are starting to adopt it. You know, the Zionism is Racism campaign as well. All of these things that were that conference in South Africa, right, early 2000s. All of these kinds of events push the Israeli state to kind of, you know, intensify this campaign of the quote-unquote new anti-Semitism. And jump forward to the mid-2010s, early 2010s, when they start to push this IHRA campaign. And the IHRA campaign is a continuation of everything that I'm talking about. It's nothing new. It just continues that long-held dynamic of trying to expel the Palestinian critique of Zionism in Israel, so as to enable and cement the settler colonial conquest of Palestine in 1948 and enable its expansion as we're seeing today. And that expansion has never stopped since 1948, of course. That's why Palestinians call it the ongoing Nakba. So the IHRA takes it to another level, though. It tries to institutionalize now the Palestinian critique as hate speech, as it asks governments and universities and companies and social media companies and other companies to adopt the IHRA definition. It is now telling them, therefore, well, see, if you adopted the IHRA definition, that means you agree that Palestinian critiques of Zionism in Israel are, the Palestinian critique of Zionism in Israel is anti-Semitic, and therefore is hate speech and is criminal. And therefore, it should not be protected by academic freedom. I mean, this is the one clause in academic freedom, which should be there, of course, I agree with it, that academic freedom does not mean that you can engage in hate speech. You no longer have academic freedom if you're engaging in hate speech. So if the IHRA is adopted by universities and governments, it might not even have to be adopted by universities, by the way. If it's adopted by governments, then certain groups can come and take it to universities and say, well, what you're saying is protecting this person through academic freedom does not apply because what they're engaging with is hate speech. And again, there's no intellectual basis to the IHRA. I mean, even people who support it go, oh, the definition would not even get a D+ in my undergraduate second-year class. This is a silly document, intellectually speaking. It's stupid, just to put it bluntly, but it's dangerous. Stupid things have led to dangerous consequences forever. So the effort now then is to kind of get around the protection of academic freedom by turning it into hate speech. And that's what we're seeing intensified over the last couple of months as well. So, and in places like Germany, it sounds to me a lot worse than what's happening in Canada, but it's bad here too. It's bad in the US. It's bad in every a corner of the world that is a staunch ally of the Israeli state and that the Israeli state depends on for its settler colonial project. And by the way, as well, conversely, that those states depend on the Israeli state for their imperial interests in the region. So it's not like the Americans are being fooled by the Israel lobby to adopt the IHRA. No, they want to do this because they don't want Palestinian liberation. The Americans, they see their imperial interest, they call it strategic interest, it's imperial interest in the region as being directly challenged by Palestinian liberation. So they don't want to see that. So they're not just some innocent party being fooled into this. They're pushing it themselves. Christian Zionists are pushing the IHRA as hard as the Israeli state. So these places that we all inhabit are not for Palestinian liberation. They don't want to see it, and therefore they're okay with this censorship and silencing and erasure of the Palestinian experience, of Palestinian, especially Palestinian aspirations for liberation. This has dire consequences across the board. It has, of course, number one is the Palestinian people, who continue to face genocide and ethnic cleansing, who the Israeli state believes they're going to break. The Israeli state believes that they can really break Palestinian resistance once and for all in this operation. And I'm not talking about Hamas here. I'm talking about Palestinian resistance as a whole across the West Bank, in Jerusalem, across the world, in Gaza, everywhere. That Palestinians will finally submit to the settler colonial project, accept their fate as just basically an oppressed, colonized people, the majority of whom will one day leave the land because it will be uninhabitable for them. I mean, that's what Israel wants. So it has dire consequences, of course, for the Palestinian people everywhere and their aspirations for liberation. And it has dire consequences for Jewish communities in Canada, in the US, in France, in Germany, and all of these other places. One of the important anti-Semitic tropes, and Samer explained it exactly what real anti-Semitism is, which is around Anglo-Euro white supremacy, is that Jewish communities in, let's say, the UK, don't really have any allegiance to the UK, and their true allegiance is to some other, global project of whatever anti-Semitic thing people throw out there for that, right? Like some conspiracy theory. But the key part here is that they're not trusted as citizens of their own states, which of course they are. This is anti-Semitism. But the Israeli state, in pushing this narrative that all Jewish communities everywhere are necessarily aligned with the Zionist project and the Israeli state, which is factually incorrect. But when they push that narrative, they cement and advance that anti-Semitic trope. Now people start to look at Jewish communities as being more aligned with Israel than they are in their own country. So it actually has really dangerous consequences, I'd say, in the immediate term, but also, and probably more importantly, in the long term. That people will now see Jewish communities as not really belonging to their own countries, whether that's Germany, Canada, the US, France, UK, or whatever. And Hil Aked captured this, a Jewish scholar in the UK, captured this very well in their book, Friends of Israel, when they characterized the weaponization of anti-Semitism as catastrophic, and I quote, for Jewish communities effectively positioned by the IHRA definition as human shields to protect Israeli apartheid and criticism, end quote. I mean, to me, that quite captures quite well that threat that I'm speaking to here. That also Jewish communities will face as a result of these weaponizations of anti-Semitism. And I'll add this to finish. It also dilutes anti-Semitism. People know, I mean, anybody who like the majority of people listening to this panel, or if they saw the description for it, would say it is absolutely ludicrous that you would call this anti-Semitic. Ludicrous. Most people would not accept that. They might be too afraid to say that out loud, but let me tell you, most people are not buying that. That then dilutes the meaning of anti-Semitism in the majority of people's heads. And then they start to go, every time they hear a charge of anti-Semitism, they go, well, is that real? And this is dangerous too, because anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism from white supremacy is real, and it is increasing, according to studies. So people starting to doubt that has, of course, very serious and detrimental consequences. So if Palestinians are prevented from reaching their aspirations for liberation, do not think that this will only affect Palestinians. This has dire consequences for a lot of people. We'll feel it the most, we'll feel it now, we'll feel it the worst. But genocide has consequences. People do not forget. I've not forgotten about the genocide of indigenous people here. It makes me angry every time I read about it from hundreds of years ago. I get angry reading about Vietnam. I get angry reading about the dropping of atomic bombs on Japanese civilians. I get angry about what the brutality of the French in Haiti. I get angry about reading what the German state did to Herero people in the Namas. I mean, people do not forget this stuff. We need to speak up. We need to continue to insist on the right of the Palestinians to explain the reality of the situation, and I want to emphasize that as well to finish. This attack on academic freedom is an attack on our ability to speak about reality. I mean, academic freedom, to me, most importantly, it's not what university presidents say. Oh, everybody has a right to their opinion. That's not academic freedom. Academic freedom is the right to pursue knowledge, to engage in an honest pursuit of knowledge, to try your best to discover the reality of social and political and economic and legal and cultural life. I subscribe to the philosophy that scholars and human beings in general are not capable of describing the totality of reality. It's too much. It's beyond our ability to comprehend. But there is such a thing as an honest pursuit of trying to capture that reality. Someone telling you the earth is flat and someone telling you the earth is round. Yeah, they're not on. The job of the academic is to judge that and say, well, that's way off. This gets a lot closer to reality. So that's our job to do in social analysis as well, in political analysis as well. And this attack on academic freedom, this turning of everything into anti-Semitism, a serious critique of Israel into anti-Semitism, is an attack on our ability to describe reality. You don't have to agree with me that Israel is a settler colonial state, but I think you're not a real scholar if you don't agree with me that an attack on my ability to describe reality with evidence and facts and knowledge and logic is a serious attack that everybody should be opposed to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muhannad. We'll now open the floor for questions and comments. Yousaf, do you mind just explaining how we will proceed?
Yeah, so I think we can start with one question from Sunil. I don't know if he's still here, and if you would like to ask the question yourself.
Thank you, Yousaf, and thank you, Carlos and Ronald, for organizing this this webinar, and thank you for the speakers as well. My question was, why are these